Thank you, Melinda. Thank you, CEDA, for the opportunity to share this forum with you today. And can I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I wanted to talk both today about the infrastructure delivery program we have underway here in Victoria, but also share with you some of our thinking about the way how we support the growth and development of our great city and great state. And as many of you in the room know, because so many of you are partners in this program, over the last 8 years, we've invested in the most ambitious infrastructure delivery program our state has ever seen. And the numbers are staggering. There's 165 projects, more than $100 billion invested, that supported 50,000 direct jobs. And of course, for every high-vis vest you see on a construction site, there's another 2 jobs in the supply chain supporting that activity. And we certainly know that very few Victorians would go about their day-to-day lives without going past one of our big bill projects. We now have what was long talked about but never delivered, a pipeline of major infrastructure projects, and that pipeline has provided the certainty to invest not just in the jobs today, but also the careers for thousands of Victorians. And I think back to 5 years ago when I first visited some of those construction sites, and I met people who were really excited about working on new projects like removing level crossings and the metro tunnel after years when there wasn't a lot in the construction pipeline. Now, when I go and visit those sites and so many more, there are people who've moved from one project to another. Tunnellers who have finished up the tunnelling on the metro tunnel project and have now moved across to the North East Link. Engineers who have cut their teeth on those level crossing removals and are now helping us design the Suburban rail loop. It's also a pipeline that gives people, and particularly young people, and this follows that conversation just now about TAFE investment, it gives young people the confidence to go to TAFE, to pick up a trade, to invest in their own career, knowing that there's this long-term pipeline that also support good, secure work. We've also established delivery models that means that we can get those projects off the ground more quickly, deliver them more efficiently and deliver them in partnership with industry and the construction sector. But we also know that we need to do more. If we want to maintain the livability that we treasure here in Melbourne and Victoria, we're going to have to continue to look at how we invest in that transport pipeline of projects, but also change the conversation a little bit about how we grow as a state and, importantly, where we grow. And it is critical that we start this conversation now, because in less than a decade, Melbourne will have overtaken Sydney as Australia's largest city. And I don't say that for bragging rights to any Sydney-siders in the room today. It's not a piece of bragging, but we are a great city, so you can understand why people want to live here. But it does require us to have these conversations about how we support the movement of people around our city, because by 2050, by the late 2050s, which is really not that far away, Melbourne will be home to 9 million people. That's about the same size that London is today, but in so many ways, Melbourne is not Sydney, Melbourne is not London, and that's the challenge. Melbourne today, right now, isn't designed for the movement of 9 million people. So we have to have a really direct and honest conversation with the community, with councils, with industry about what will happen if we don't actively address how we're growing and what that looks like. For example, a bigger population, that population the size of 9 million people, means our transport network will need to support an additional 11.8 million trips per day by that late 2050s. It also means there will be an 80% increase in private vehicle trips. That's about 19 million additional trips on our road network per day. That'll see that if we don't make change, we don't make investment, there won't be standing room, let alone a seat on a train, a car park at a station car park. Our roads will be choked with traffic, and there'll be more drivers in more cars on longer commutes. Those trips will be congested, painful, and we all know, whether it's you're coming at it from an economic productivity point of view, or if you're simply just trying to get to work, drop the kids to childcare, go to school pickup, get to that medical appointment, or simply go and visit your mum and dad, that is going to add to your frustrations in your daily life. Also, too, when you also consider that what the advice is, what the expert demographic advice is, that on these current projections, there will be about half of all Melburnians will be living in the outer suburbs in the next 30 years. They too will also be further away from the services they need. They'll be further away from that job that they want. So these are some of the big challenges that we need to not just talk about now, but put in place the program for solutions. Because we see that a big house block in the outer suburbs will always have appeal, and there's a place for those housing opportunities. But we also know that we need to work hard to broaden the housing choices for Victorians, because at the same time that we are seeing more and more challenges in the housing market, that in turn is creating greater intergenerational division and equality, we're also seeing huge pressure in the rental market as well. And there's a report in the media today. There's some Reserve Bank Australia data that's reported in the media today that shows that capital city rent rises are at a 10-year high, that the rental vacancy in our capital cities is now below 1%. So if we don't act, whether it's our governments, the federal government or future ones, there will be an endless, unaffordable and unsustainable cycle of catch-up, trying to build the infrastructure and services that we need to keep pace. So we need to be able to do both. We need to be able to accommodate and plan for growth in our suburbs, but also to look at how we can maximise our established areas that are well connected to transport and services. And this is also important because at its heart, this is a fairness and equity outcome for our community. The way that we are growing at the moment is a key driver of inequality. So we know that that this challenge is not unique to Melbourne. We're not alone in looking at the transformational potential of major infrastructure. Cities around the world are facing similar pressures, and we need to continue to invest in both the housing, the transport infrastructure and the planning as a means to get ahead. And so how are we responding to these challenges here in Victoria? It does start with those generational investments, not just in infrastructure, but in how our city grows. And this brings me to a conversation about the Suburban Rail Loop. Suburban Rail Loop is this game changer where it will both revolutionise our public transport system. It'll also reshape our city over time. And the transport benefits are obvious: a train network like the great cities of the world, an orbital train line that connects all of our current major metropolitan train networks, puts new train stations into the heart of Monash University, into the heart of Deakin University at Burwood. There will be high-tech trains powered by 100% renewables and services every few minutes so you can throw away the timetable. What this means, particularly for many without a car, it means that being without a car means being without a decent job. And for some, courses, educational opportunities are completely off the table for some school leavers if they don't have a car, because quite simply the TAFE or uni opportunity is too far away. Efficient and accessible public transport does level the playing field, and that's one aspect that the Suburban Rail Loop will deliver. But the rail project is also just the start. We won't just be building those new stations and sit back and see what happens around each of these station precincts. This year, we are starting the precinct structure planning process for those areas around the 6 new Suburban Rail Loop East stations. We will be engaging in a massive program of consultation across the community. Local communities will in turn get a clearer picture of the extraordinary opportunity we have to prepare for a shared vision for the future. Places that build on the characteristics of the existing community as vibrant, livable, walkable and sustainable. And we know, we've seen this in other cities too, that these stations will be magnets for activity and investment. People will want to live there, businesses will want to locate there, and that in turn will drive new and more diverse housing opportunities and job opportunities closer to home. We need to build the infrastructure that fundamentally reshapes our city and suburbs, transforming also, in turn, Melbourne from a city centred around a single central business district to a big city of multiple economic centres. And certainly something only as radical as the Suburban Rail Loop can achieve such a radical shift in the geography of our city. Now, when it comes to those Suburban Rail Loop precincts, the 6 that we're starting on with the Suburban Rail Loop East part of the project, each precinct will be different. They already are, and we will be planning them differently in accordance with their local characteristics in partnership with the local community. Box Hill today is already very different to Burwood and Clayton, very different to Cheltenham. What surrounds a train station at Monash University in the future will be very different to what surrounds one at Glen Waverley. So this will involve some really detailed conversations. They might at times be difficult conversations. But I'll be political here for a minute. We certainly reject the views of our political opponents and indeed some academics in the community that we need to finalise these plans before we go out and talk to the community. Genuine consultation means having a genuinely open mind about what's possible in each of these locations and helping the community shape and realise this potential. That's the work that we'll be starting, indeed have already started, but we'll really go into that detailed planning stage with the precinct structure plans. And also too, it's about making sure that social infrastructure is also part of this conversation at the start of the construction program, so the infrastructure, that sort of infrastructure is there when the train stations are being opened. And we certainly know we can do it because we've done it before. The power of city-shaping infrastructure has been demonstrated in Melbourne time and time again. Trains started to run on Melbourne's City Loop in the mid-1980s. But the concept of the Melbourne City Loop had been talked about for as far back as the 1920s. When it was finally built, many, many decades later, it was its biggest infrastructure investment of its era. But it wasn't just that new underground rail line and the stations that transformed the city. Just as important was what happened above the ground when the City Loop was opened. Targeted land use policies, the Postcode 3000 initiative, which was an incentive to encourage more people to come and live in the city of Melbourne, played a critical role in transforming the city. And so the development of places like Melbourne Central, St Kilda Road, South Bank Precinct also helped encourage higher value residential and commercial development, and in turn supported more jobs and economic activity. And this impact continued long after the City Loop's construction. It also helped make Melbourne the vibrant cultural and economic powerhouse it is today. This was all made possible by bold thinking that brought together the delivery of infrastructure with land use planning and a big investment in the future and the determination to deliver it. So the Suburban Rail Loop is an important part of responding to this growth challenge, connecting people to jobs and services closer to where they live, but it's not the entire solution. We also have opportunities to continue to invest in existing centres around our city today, like at Arden, at Parkville, at Fisherman's Bend, that deliver opportunities to support those inner city precincts, which are right now well connected. It's also important that we get the right type of new housing supply right in different locations as well. And we already see how Victoria is home to some interesting and innovative models of not-for-profit developers delivering really high quality housing. So the challenge is there before us to shift the dial to increase the supply of new homes, driving consumer choice and availability of quality housing options, both in some of those established areas of Melbourne, as well as a sustainable supply of housing options in our suburbs. And just finishing on the Suburban Rail Loop again, this project on the scale and cost of the Suburban Rail Loop will of course have its critics. Yes, it's ambitious. Yes, it will require sustained investment into the years ahead. But the cost of continuing to take the path of least resistance on our growth challenge is, quite frankly, a cost our city cannot afford. We're already having the tough conversations and doing the work. We refuse to be a government, like some that have gone before us, that have kicked the can down the road. And as the Premier said when we announced the Suburban Rail Loop back in August of 2018, we won't be the people standing around cutting the ribbon at the end of this project, but we know we have to get it started. We know we have to get moving on it because our city and state will be better for it. And just in finishing, as part of delivering this program, as we've done over the past 8 years, but in the years ahead, there's also an opportunity not just to work with so many of you in the room as partners in our construction program, in partners in our land use development. There's also the opportunity for you to help us shape this change, to be part of the conversation, either in your local community or in industry, because we want industry to bring their best ideas to whether it's the Suburban Rail Loop precincts or some of those others. And also we look forward to working with local government as well as we continue to on this challenging path. But it's important because, quite simply, we need to make sure that we continue to support the livability, the productivity and the wonderful vibrancy that we have here in Melbourne and Victoria for the years ahead. So thank you for the opportunity to share this with you today.
Just while the minister's getting settled, obviously people have cottoned on to the Pigeonhole app. If you haven't, QR codes on your table will give you the conference app, and so you can ask questions. And you're also going to see information on all the speakers, which also saves us from having to read out bios. So just to, if you haven't already got onto the conference app, please do so, and information on the table. Minister, I'm going to jump right into it. We've got about 10 minutes. I think one of the first questions I wanted to ask, given that we had the opportunity to have the federal minister in the room as well, and she mentioned that the federal government is going to be looking more carefully at the budgeting that the states are doing. How is that going to influence your decision making, or will it?
Can I say at the outset that I am so deeply grateful, and I'm not going to be political for a moment, I'm so deeply grateful that after 9 years of not having a conversation, that I get a chance to have a conversation with a federal infrastructure minister. And I don't say that lightly, because it has been a real challenge for Victoria over the previous 8 or 9 years to be able to talk about whether it's projects of national significance and the work that Catherine's doing in reshaping the infrastructure pipeline so that the federal government is going back to what it should be investing in, which is those big, important, nation-shaping projects, not suburban car parks, but making sure it's focused on delivering in partnership with the states those projects, that whether it's driving efficiencies in our freight network, our road network, the big public transport investments that we need. So the first thing is, it's great to be able to have those conversations. Now, that doesn't mean that there'll always be harmonious agreement on every aspect of the program, and I do agree with what Catherine said before in terms of you need that healthy back and forth. You know, states will have its priorities, the federal governments do as well, and that's completely legitimate. But the important thing is that there's a forum, that there's an avenue to sit down and talk about these initiatives and to share the priority pipeline. And so that's why, whether it's the work that the federal government and Catherine is leading on taking Infrastructure Australia kind of back to where it was in some ways, but also learning from that journey and making sure that there is a very, very clear understanding for all of us around what the role of Infrastructure Australia is. That's really, really welcome, as is wanting to really normalise and stabilise the investments that are made in the infrastructure pipeline.
So one of the things that we're going to be talking about today is, of course, the energy transition. But Minister King also spoke about the really important focus that's going to have to be on transport if we're going to get our emissions reductions efforts going where they need to. You talked about the tremendous population growth that Victoria and Melbourne are going to experience. You talked about the number of car trips that's going to involve. How are you thinking about the challenge of decarbonisation? And there's a specific question here in the Pigeonhole as well around how you're thinking about the last mile of transport, to reduce car trips.
There are many aspects, Linda, in that, because there's the big shared federal state work that needs to go on in this space, and that involves specific initiatives and work with, for example, the freight industry that works across state borders, but targeting it more locally at a state level. One of the reasons why we need to continue to invest in better public transport, light and heavy rail, is for exactly that reason. The movement, the mass transit piece is really, really critical towards supporting the decarbonisation of our community, because the move to zero emissions vehicles, and we've got an initiative here about transitioning our bus fleet to zero emissions over the coming years. There is still the challenge that with a growing population, it doesn't matter whether it's a petrol car or an electric car on the road. There is still also going to be that additional challenge of how do you manage the available road space, and that brings you to your question about the observation about the last mile piece. And there's a lot of work that goes on here about and it's anyone's tried to do the bus train connection thing. There's great frustration amongst communities that the buses and the trains don't connect up, and that's a really simple transport planning piece that we are continuing to work through. But then there's also, it goes to the question about how we plan our communities, how we make sure that we plan our communities in a way so, quite simply, there's a footpath to the train station. And one of the challenges that we've got particularly in some of our growing communities, is some of that careful planning hasn't kept pace with the housing growth in those areas. So it's it sounds pretty simple, but it does require some additional coordination, and that's where there's some work that's going on. Machinery of government changes doesn't get everyone excited, but it gets some of us excited. And there's the simple change by bringing together the Department of Transport and Planning together following the last state election is designed to deliver exactly this. How do we make sure that as whether it's building new communities in the growth areas or looking at designing what's happening around the suburban rail loop stations, really drilling down and making sure that we are providing those walkable communities, that there's the bike hoops at the train stations, that the buses are connected to the train stations. Everyone's got a view, I think, on e-scooters. What is the role of that sort of mode of transport going to play in helping to provide for those connections? So that is what we're wanting to drive through the machinery of government change that happened after last November's state election.
Thank you. Top of the pops on the questions. I'm going to truncate it. Is how is the state addressing the current accessibility and mobility issues in the West, which I think possibly links back to the comments you were making about some of the planning and housing growth? Yeah, so I think there's some specific challenges we've got in the West, and I'm going to take it from the person who submitted that question. They live in the West, so they know better than I do about some of those challenges from living in one of the fastest, if not, I think Wyndham is the fastest growing, if not, it's in the top 3 or 4 fastest growing communities in the country. And this again goes back to that observation I just made about how we've got a better plan for those communities, because it's not just about building new train stations, which we are doing in the western suburbs. We're building 2 or 3 new train stations in and around the western suburbs. We've got to make sure that people can get there with an alternative that's not their car, because giant car parks will serve a purpose, but they won't serve for the growth purpose of making sure that people can get to their train station, and particularly if we're wanting to consider how do we reduce that second and third car dependency that many households have in the outer suburbs, because there is a correlation, an economic disadvantage correlation between greater car ownership and economic disadvantage. And so that's where the fairness and the equity piece comes in, about looking at how we both not just plan the housing but plan the communities and the transport connections. So that's a really long way, Melinda, sorry, of saying that we are looking at that kind of macro level. But in terms of the West, look, there is a list of initiatives. As I said, we're building new train stations, we're removing level crossings, we're investing in additional train services, but there is no doubt that there is a significant additional amount of work that we need to do in those growing areas where there is, to be frank, there's still quite a bit of catch up to do because of the way the growth has been happening in those areas. I knew we were going to run out of time. I'll have to get you to come back and have a conversation at some point about the role that the Commonwealth Games can play in helping to transform infrastructure and create infrastructure value for the community in the way that we're already seeing a lot of conversations around the Olympics and Paralympics in Brisbane. It's disappeared off my pigeonhole, but every time I'm on stage with a minister in Victoria, I get a question that asks about train to the airport. Timelines.
Yeah, look, well, that's no surprise because, the airport was opened in 1970? And there was a reservation made then, and we're still talking about it in we're not talking about it. There is a shared funding commitment from the state and federal government to deliver the airport rail, and a lot of talking about in terms of careful planning, a huge amount of planning went into thinking about how do we not just build an airport rail and invest $10 billion of collective taxpayer funding in this, but to make sure it connects to the rest of the network, which is why we're seeing it go through Sunshine. Connecting airport rail through Sunshine means we have huge precinct development opportunities around Sunshine Station, because it is going to be a major transport hub where you'll be 11 minutes to the airport from Sunshine. You'll be 18 minutes into the city. And so connecting it into the existing network provides that connectivity and that fairness opportunity. And for Catherine and I, the Ballarat and Bendigo trains are going to stop at Sunshine and connect into the airport as well, which we're really pleased about. So there's a lot of work. There's some works happening around Sunshine that are kicking off next month on that station redevelopment that's part of the project. There's tender processes underway. We're continuing to, work through each project milestone on that project because it is still going to take a number of years to deliver a rail project of that size and scale.
I can guarantee that you will continue to be asked about that, and as will the Treasurer every time he's on stage. Minister, thank you so much for joining us and for your contribution today.